The desert wind carried more than sand across the rugged landscape of Arizona Territory in 1871. It carried the whispered prayers of women, whose stories would be buried beneath decades of silence. Their voices lost to a history written only by men with guns and government commissions. Maria Consuela Santos clutched her infant daughter closer as she watched the dust cloud approaching from the east. The Mexican woman had married into the Aravepa Apache band 3 years earlier, finding love and acceptance among people her own culture had taught her to fear. Now, as the distant thunder of hoofbeats grew louder, she understood that her two worlds were about to collide in ways that would shatter both. The Apache women had always been the backbone of their communities, yet their roles remained invisible to the white settlers and soldiers who viewed them only as obstacles to civilization. These women were diplomats who negotiated between warring factions, healers who tended to wounds both physical and spiritual, and warriors who fought with a ferocity that matched any man when their families were threatened. But history would remember only the men who carried rifles, not the women who carried the future of their people in their arms. Ishtan, an Apache woman whose name meant "woman who sees far," had spent months traveling between military camps and Apache strongholds, attempting to broker peace agreements that would protect her people from the growing violence. She spoke 4 languages fluently and understood the complex political landscape better than most military commanders. Yet when she arrived at Camp Grant in early 1871, the soldiers saw only another squaw to be dismissed and ignored. The tragedy that was unfolding had roots stretching back generations. But few understood how the systematic targeting of Apache women represented a deliberate strategy of cultural destruction. Military leaders had learned that destroying the women meant destroying the tribe's ability to sustain itself. Women were the keepers of tradition, the teachers of children, the voices that passed down the stories and customs that defined Apache identity. Sarah Bowman, a mixed-race woman who had lived among both Apache and white communities, tried desperately to warn anyone who would listen about the growing hatred she witnessed in Tucson's saloons and meeting halls. She had seen the way men spoke about Apache women, reducing them to targets rather than human beings. Her warnings fell on deaf ears, dismissed by those who saw her as a traitor to her white heritage and an outsider to Apache culture. The spring of 1871 brought an unusual period of hope. To the Aravepa Apache band living near Camp Grant, they had agreed to a peace settlement, turning in their weapons and submitting to military supervision in exchange for protection and supplies. The women had convinced the warriors to try this path, believing that cooperation might save their children from the violence that had claimed so many. Apache lives, Lieutenant Royal Whitman, the young officer overseeing the Camp Grant arrangement, was one of the few military men who recognized the intelligence and strength of the Apache women. He relied heavily on their counsel and began to understand how their influence shaped tribal decisions. In his letters to his superiors, he wrote extensively about their diplomatic skills and their genuine desire for peace, but in the nearby town of Tucson, a different story was being told. Newspaper editor John Wasson published inflammatory articles that portrayed all Apaches as savage threats to civilization, deliberately ignoring the peaceful settlement at Camp Grant. His words fanned the flames of hatred among settlers who had lost family members to Apache raids, creating a dangerous momentum that would soon explode into violence. The women at Camp Grant tried to maintain their traditional roles while adapting to this strange new life of forced dependence on military rations and protection. They taught their children the old stories while learning English words that might help them navigate this changing world. They wove baskets and prepared food, maintaining the cultural practices that connected them to their ancestors, while hoping to build bridges to a peaceful future. As winter turned to spring in 1871, these women could not have known that their efforts at accommodation were being viewed as weakness by their enemies. They could not have foreseen that their willingness to trust would be used against them in the most brutal way possible. The tragedy that was approaching would claim their lives while erasing their stories, leaving behind only the accounts of those who refused to see them as fully human. The desert wind continued to blow, carrying with it the hopes and fears of women who stood at the crossroads between two worlds, trying to find a path that would lead to survival for their children and their people. Their courage in the face of impossible odds would be forgotten, their sacrifice ignored, their wisdom dismissed. But their story deserves to be told, even now, more than a century later, when the wind still whispers across the Arizona desert where they lived, loved, and died. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Camp Grant settlement as Eskiminzen's band continued their cautious experiment with peace. Among the 500 Apaches living under military protection, the women had emerged as the true architects of this fragile alliance. While history would remember Eskiminzen as the chief who sought accommodation with the whites, it was the women who made that accommodation possible through their daily acts of diplomacy and adaptation. Has HKE acute-ba-nzn, whose name meant anger, had earned her title through years of fierce resistance to white encroachment. But now she channeled that same intensity into building relationships with the soldiers' wives and the handful of white women who lived near the camp. She learned to prepare coffee the way the white women liked it, while teaching them to weave baskets using traditional Apache techniques. These small exchanges represented something revolutionary. In a territory where racial violence had become commonplace, the Apache women had developed an intricate understanding of white culture that went far beyond what most white settlers knew about Apache ways. They studied the soldiers' routines, learned their names, and began to understand the complex hierarchy of military rank. They recognized that success in this new world required more than simple submission. It demanded active engagement and strategic thinking. Lieutenant Whitman found himself increasingly dependent on the counsel of women like Nadiol, an elderly Apache woman who had witnessed decades of conflict and understood the deep roots of the current crisis. She explained to him how previous peace agreements had failed, because white leaders had never understood that Apache society was not organized like white society, with clear chains of command and absolute authority figures. Decisions were made through consensus, and women's voices carried significant weight in that process. The women at Camp Grant developed sophisticated strategies for protecting their families while honoring the peace agreement. They created early warning networks that could alert the camp to approaching strangers, whether friendly or hostile. They established protocols for sharing scarce resources and mediating disputes that might otherwise escalate into violence. Most importantly, they worked to keep their young men engaged in peaceful activities, knowing that boredom and frustration could easily turn into rebellion, but outside the protective boundaries of Camp Grant, forces were gathering that would make all these careful efforts meaningless. In Tucson, a group of influential men had decided that the only solution to the Apache problem was complete extermination. They viewed the peace settlement as a dangerous precedent that might encourage other Apache bands to seek similar arrangements, prolonging what they saw as an inevitable final conflict. William Sanders Ari, a Confederate veteran and prominent Tucson citizen, began organizing what he called a Committee of Public Safety. The committee's true purpose was to plan an attack on the peaceful Apaches at Camp Grant, but Ari was careful to frame their mission in terms of self-defense and justice. He spread stories about Apache raids that had never happened and claimed that the women and children at Camp Grant were secretly supporting hostile warriors in the field. The women at Camp Grant remained largely unaware of these growing threats, focused as they were on the immediate challenges of daily survival. They struggled with the inadequate government rations, worked to maintain their cultural traditions while adapting to new circumstances, and tried to prepare their children for an uncertain future. Many had begun learning English, recognizing that communication would be essential for long-term survival in a white-dominated world. Maria Consuela Santos had become a bridge between the Apache and Mexican communities, translating not just languages but cultural concepts that often had no direct equivalents. She helped Apache women understand why white women seemed so restricted in their movements and decision-making, while explaining to the few Mexican women she encountered why Apache women held such prominent Roles in their society. The spring of 1871 brought both hope and anxiety to the women of Camp Grant. Their men had successfully avoided conflict for several months, and some of the younger Apache men had even found work with local ranchers and mining operations. The women began to believe that this new life might actually be sustainable, that their children might grow up in a world where Apache and white cultures could coexist, but they also sensed the growing hostility from the surrounding white and Mexican communities. When they traveled to Tucson for supplies or trade, they faced increasingly hostile stares and whispered threats. Some shopkeepers refused to serve them entirely, while others charged inflated prices that made basic necessities almost unaffordable. The women responded to these challenges by strengthening their internal networks and support systems. They developed new forms of mutual aid that combined traditional Apache practices with adaptations necessary for their current circumstances. They shared information about which white traders could be trusted, which routes were safest for travel, and which military personnel were most sympathetic to their situation. As April 1871 approached, the women at Camp Grant continued their delicate balancing act between hope and caution. They had created something unprecedented in the bloody history of Apache-white relations, a functioning example of peaceful coexistence. Their success in maintaining this peace, despite enormous obstacles and pressures, demonstrated capabilities and wisdom that their enemies were determined to deny. The tragedy that was approaching would not just claim their lives. It would destroy the proof they had created that another way was possible. In the dusty streets of Tucson during the early months of 1871, a conspiracy was taking shape that would forever change the lives of the Apache women at Camp Grant. The conspiracy was not born in secret meetings or hidden chambers, but in the open conversations of respectable businessmen who had convinced themselves that mass murder was both necessary and justified. Jesus Maria Elias, a wealthy Mexican rancher whose family had lost livestock to Apache raids years earlier, found himself transformed into one of the most vocal advocates for what the conspirators euphemistically called direct action. Elias had once traded peacefully with Apache bands, even employing some Apache women as domestic servants in his household. But the economic pressures of territorial expansion and the inflammatory rhetoric of Tucson's newspapers had gradually poisoned his perspective. The women in Elias's own household, both Mexican and Tohono O'odham servants, watched with growing alarm as their employer hosted increasingly heated discussions about the Apache threat. These women understood better than most white men the reality of Apache society. Having worked alongside Apache women in various capacities over the years, they knew that the women at Camp Grant posed no military threat to anyone, but their voices carried no weight in the councils of war being planned by their masters. William Arias' Committee of Public Safety had grown to include nearly 150 men, representing a cross-section of Tucson society. There were Anglo settlers seeking revenge for past losses, Mexican ranchers protecting their economic interests, and Tohono O'odham warriors carrying ancient grudges against their traditional Apache enemies. What united these diverse groups was a shared willingness to ignore the peaceful reality at Camp Grant in favor of a narrative that justified extreme violence. The committee's propaganda campaign deliberately focused on dehumanizing Apache women, portraying them not as mothers, wives, and community leaders, but as breeding machines for future warriors. Ari and his allies spread the false narrative that Apache women were biologically different from other women, lacking normal maternal instincts and actively encouraging their children to become killers. This racist mythology made it psychologically easier for otherwise ordinary men to contemplate mass murder. Sarah Bowman, the mixed-race woman who had tried to warn authorities about the growing danger, found herself increasingly isolated as the conspiracy gained momentum. White settlers viewed her warnings as evidence of divided loyalty, while Apache women were suspicious of any outsider who moved freely between both communities. Her attempts to alert Lieutenant Whitman at Camp Grant were dismissed as the ravings of a woman. whose judgment had been compromised by too much contact with savages. The most insidious aspect of the conspiracy was how it twisted genuine grief and trauma into justification for atrocity. Many of the men planning the attack had indeed lost family members to Apache raids in previous years. Their pain was real, their anger understandable. But Ari and his allies skillfully manipulated these emotions, convincing grieving fathers and husbands that killing peaceful Apache women and children would somehow balance the scales of justice. At Camp Grant, the Apache women continued their daily routines, unaware that their lives had been reduced to talking points in Tucson's saloons and meeting halls. They woke before dawn to prepare food for their families, spent their days tending to children and maintaining their temporary shelters, and gathered in the evenings to share news and stories. Their normalcy, their humanity, their obvious desire for peace made no impression on men who had already decided they were enemies of civilization. Lieutenant Whitman had received scattered reports about hostile talk in Tucson, but military bureaucracy and interagency rivalries prevented him from taking effective action. His superiors in the territorial government were more concerned with maintaining good relations with influential Tucson businessmen than with protecting a group of Apaches who were already viewed as a temporary inconvenience. The women at Camp Grant had developed their own intelligence network, but it focused primarily on tracking the movements of potentially hostile Apache bands in the surrounding mountains. They were not prepared to defend against an attack by the very people they had been told would protect them. Their trust in the peace agreement had been carefully cultivated over months of cooperation, and that trust now made them vulnerable to betrayal. Ishton, the far-seeing woman who had worked so hard to negotiate the original peace agreement, began experiencing disturbing dreams that filled her with unnamed dread. She tried to share her concerns with other women in the camp, but they were reluctant to abandon the security they had finally achieved. After years of constant warfare and displacement, the stability of Camp Grant felt too precious to give up based on vague premonitions. The conspiracy reached its final planning stages in early April 1871. As Ari and his allies selected April 30th as the date for their attack. They chose that date specifically because they knew most of the Apache men would be away from camp, gathering mescal plants in the surrounding mountains. The attack was designed to target women, children, and elderly people who could not effectively resist. In the days leading up to the attack, several women in Tucson who had learned about the plan attempted to warn the authorities, but their warnings were either ignored or dismissed as hysterical female anxiety about matters beyond their understanding. The masculine culture of frontier violence had no place for women's voices, whether they spoke in defense of Apache families or in opposition to mass murder. The silence surrounding the conspiracy was not accidental but carefully orchestrated. Participants were sworn to secrecy, and potential witnesses were either recruited into the plot or intimidated into silence. The few individuals who might have stopped the massacre were either unaware of its scope or powerless to intervene effectively. As the sun set on April 29, 1871, the Apache women at Camp Grant settled into their evening routines, unaware that it would be their last peaceful night. The conspiracy of silence that had enabled the planning of their destruction would soon become a conspiracy of forgetting, as survivors and witnesses would be pressured to bury the truth of what was about to happen. April 30th, 1871, began like any other morning at Camp Grant. The Apache women rose before dawn, as they had for generations, to begin their daily tasks. They stirred the embers of cooking fires, prepared food for their families, and organized the work that would sustain their small community through another day. The men had left 3 days earlier to harvest mescal in the mountains, leaving the camp populated primarily by women, children, and elderly people who could not make the difficult journey. Maria Consuela Santos was nursing her infant daughter when she heard the first sounds that seemed out of place. Dogs were barking with unusual intensity, and she could hear what sounded like distant voices carried on the wind. But the sounds were too far away to cause immediate alarm, and she returned her attention to her child. Grateful for these quiet morning moments that had become so precious in their new life of imposed. Peace. Has HK acute ba NZ and was already awake and working. Her practiced hands weaving a basket while her mind worried over the dreams that had disturbed her sleep. She had seen fire and blood, heard the screams of children, felt the earth trembling beneath running feet. But dreams were often messages from the spirits, warnings that could help her people from danger. She had survived too many years of warfare to ignore such visions entirely. At approximately 4:30 in the morning, as the first pale light began to illuminate the eastern horizon, William Ari's force of 148 men reached the outskirts of the sleeping Apache camp. The attackers had traveled through the night, their approach carefully planned to avoid detection by military patrols. They had divided into 3 groups to surround the camp completely, ensuring that no one could escape the trap they had prepared. The first Apache woman to recognize the approaching danger was an elderly grandmother named Na Yuki, whose failing eyesight was compensated by exceptionally acute hearing. She detected the sound of horses moving slowly through the brush, the clink of metal equipment, and the whispered commands of men trying to maintain stealth. Her warnings came too late to save most of the camp, but her shouts alerted some families to flee into the darkness. The attack began with a coordinated assault from 3 directions. As Ari's men opened fire on the waking camp, the Apache women's first instinct was to protect their children, grabbing infants and toddlers while calling for older children to run toward the river where they might find cover among the rocks and vegetation. But the attackers had anticipated this response and positioned men to cut off all escape routes. Ishtan, the woman whose diplomatic skills had helped create the peace agreement, found herself trapped in her shelter with 3 grandchildren as bullets tore through the thin walls. She used her body to shield the children while trying to dig an escape tunnel through the earthen floor with her bare hands. Her last act was to push the smallest child through a gap in the rear wall, whispering prayers in Apache that the boy might survive to remember his people. The violence that followed defied comprehension, as men who considered themselves civilized Christians systematically murdered women and children who had trusted in their promises of protection. The attackers used clubs and knives as well as guns, pursuing fleeing families with a thoroughness that revealed the planned nature of their assault. They showed no mercy to the pregnant women, the nursing mothers, or the children who begged for their lives in broken English. Maria Consuela Santos ran toward the river with her infant daughter pressed against her chest, her mixed heritage offering no protection from attackers who saw only Apache enemies. A Tohono O'odham warrior struck her down with a war club, and her last conscious act was to cover her baby's body with her own, hoping to save at least one innocent life from the madness that had engulfed their peaceful settlement. Some women fought back with whatever weapons they could find, proving that their peaceful intentions had never indicated weakness or cowardice. They threw rocks, wielded cooking implements as weapons, and used their intimate knowledge of the terrain to lead children to temporary safety. But they were vastly outnumbered and had no access to the firearms that might have made resistance effective. The massacre continued for nearly 2 hours, as the attackers moved methodically through the camp to ensure that no potential survivors remained hidden. They set fire to the shelters, destroyed food supplies and personal belongings, and mutilated the bodies of their victims in ways that demonstrated their complete rejection of Apache humanity. The few military personnel who might have intervened were either absent or deliberately kept away from the scene. Lieutenant Whitman was 5 miles away at the main military post when he heard the distant sound of gunfire. By the time he organized a relief force and reached the scene, the attackers had already withdrawn, leaving behind a landscape of horror that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The young officer found the bodies of women he had spoken with just days earlier, children he had watched playing in the camp, elderly people whose wisdom he had come to respect. The final casualty count would never be precisely determined, but estimates ranged from 108 to 144 dead, with the vast majority being women and children. Among the dead were the diplomatic leaders who had made the peace agreement possible. the cultural teachers who transmitted Apache traditions to the next generation, and the community organizers who had held the band together through months of difficult transition. In the immediate aftermath of the massacre, a strange silence fell over the scene. The attackers had vanished back to Tucson to celebrate their victory, while the few survivors huddled among the rocks near the river, too traumatized to emerge. The silence would soon become a conspiracy of forgetting, as those responsible worked to bury the truth of what they had done beneath layers of justification and denial. The smoke had barely cleared from the Camp Grant massacre when the cover-up began. Within hours of the attack, the men who had participated in the slaughter were already crafting a narrative that would transform mass murder into heroic self-defense. The women who had died could not speak for themselves, and the few survivors were too traumatized and marginalized to challenge. The official story that was rapidly taking shape. William Ari returned to Tucson that afternoon to find the town celebrating what they called a great victory over Apache savagery. Saloons offered free drinks to the heroes who had struck a blow for civilization, while newspaper editor John Wasson prepared articles that would praise the attackers' courage and determination. The fact that their courage had been demonstrated against sleeping women and defenseless children was conveniently omitted from these early accounts. Lieutenant Royal Whitman faced an impossible situation as he surveyed the carnage at Camp Grant. His official reports would have to document the brutal reality of what had happened, but he also understood that his military career depended on not alienating the powerful political interests that had supported the massacre. His initial telegrams to superior officers carefully emphasized the peaceful nature of the victims while understating the premeditated character of the attack. The few Apache survivors of the massacre were scattered and traumatized, many suffering from serious wounds that made survival uncertain. No Yuki, the elderly woman whose warnings had saved some lives, lingered for 3 days before dying from injuries sustained during her escape attempt. Before she died, she told other survivors that the spirits of the murdered women would never rest until their stories were properly told and their killers faced justice. Sarah Bowman, who had tried so desperately to warn authorities about the planned attack, found herself blamed for failing to prevent a tragedy that no one else had wanted to stop. Military officials suggested that her warnings had been too vague to act upon, while civilian authorities questioned why she had not provided more specific information about the conspiracy. The failure of the system to protect innocent people was being transformed into a failure of one powerless woman to save them. President Ulysses Grant, responding to national outrage over the massacre, ordered a federal investigation led by Vincent Collier, a peace commissioner with instructions to determine what had really happened at Camp Grant. But Collier's investigation was hampered from the beginning by a conspiracy of silence among those who knew the truth. Witnesses disappeared, documents were destroyed, and testimony was carefully coordinated to minimize the culpability of the attackers. The territorial government of Arizona Territory, led by officials who had either supported the massacre or failed to prevent it, worked actively to obstruct the federal investigation. Governor Anson Safford publicly defended the attackers while privately pressuring potential witnesses to remain silent. The territorial legislature passed resolutions praising the brave men who had struck a blow for frontier justice, creating an official endorsement of the murders. Jesus, Maria Elias, and other Mexican participants in the massacre found themselves caught between conflicting loyalties and interests. The Mexican community in Tucson was divided between those who supported the attack and those who were horrified by its brutality. Some Mexican women who had worked alongside Apache women in various contexts tried to speak out about the humanity of the victims, but their voices were dismissed as the emotional reactions of people too close to the situation to judge it objectively. The Tohono O'odham warriors who had participated in the massacre were placed in an even more precarious position. Their traditional enmity with Apache bands had made them willing allies in the attack, but they now faced potential federal prosecution for their role in what was increasingly being characterized as a crime against the United States government. Some were pressured to claim they had been coerced into participation, while others were promised protection in exchange for their silence. Military investigators who attempted to interview survivors found their efforts frustrated by language barriers, cultural misunderstandings, and the genuine trauma experienced by those who had witnessed the massacre. Many Apache survivors were reluctant to speak with any white officials, having learned that cooperation with white authorities could lead to further danger. The women who might have provided the most detailed and accurate accounts were mostly dead. Their voices silenced forever. The cover-up was facilitated by widespread public support for the massacre among white settlers throughout Arizona Territory. Local newspapers praised the attackers as heroes who had solved the Apache problem through decisive action, while condemning federal officials who sought to prosecute them as enemies of frontier progress. This popular support made it politically dangerous for any official to pursue aggressive prosecution of those responsible. As months passed, the official investigation became increasingly focused on technical questions of jurisdiction and procedure, rather than the fundamental issue of accountability for mass murder. Federal prosecutors argued over whether territorial or federal courts had jurisdiction, while defense attorneys challenged the standing of Apache survivors to testify against white defendants. The legal system that was supposed to deliver justice became another mechanism for denying it. The most tragic aspect of the cover-up was how it erased not just the crimes committed against Apache women, but their entire existence as human beings worthy of memory and respect. Official reports reduced them to statistics, casualty figures that documented the scope of the massacre without acknowledging the individual lives that had been lost. Their names, their relationships, their contributions to their community, and their hopes for peace were all buried beneath bureaucratic language that rendered them invisible. By the end of 1871, it was clear that no one would face meaningful consequences for the Camp Grant massacre. A few participants were briefly arrested and released, while the actual organizers of the attack continued to hold prominent positions in territorial society. The message was clear: the lives of Apache women were worth less than the political convenience of the men who had ordered their deaths. The years following the Camp Grant massacre witnessed a systematic erasure of memory that went far beyond the legal cover-up. The story of the Apache women who had died became a casualty of what historians would later call the myth of the frontier, a narrative that required heroes and villains, but had no place for the complex humanity of indigenous women who had sought peace in an impossible world. Within a decade of the massacre, even the location of the attack had become disputed territory in the battle over historical memory. Local white historians began claiming that Camp Grant had been a military target rather than a peaceful settlement, that the victims had been warriors rather than women and children, and that the attack had been a legitimate act of self-defense rather than premeditated murder. These lies were repeated so often they began to take on the appearance of established fact. The few Apache survivors of the massacre were scattered across the Southwest, many living on reservations far from their traditional territories. When government agents or curious researchers occasionally sought them out for their accounts of what had happened, they found people whose trauma had been compounded by decades of silence and official denial. Some survivors refused to speak about the massacre at all, while others provided carefully limited accounts that revealed only fragments of the larger tragedy. Sarah Bowman, the mixed-race woman who had tried to warn authorities about the planned attack, spent her remaining years as a living reminder of the failure to prevent the massacre. She was alternately celebrated as a hero and condemned as a traitor, depending on who was telling the story and what point they wanted to make. Her actual words and actions became less important than her symbolic value in various competing narratives about frontier justice and racial conflict. Lieutenant Royal Whitman, whose military career never recovered from his association with the Camp Grant peace experiment, wrote extensively about his experiences in private letters and journals that would not be discovered until decades after his death. His accounts provided some of the most detailed descriptions of the Apache women's diplomatic efforts and community leadership, but these documents remained buried in family archives while official military histories repeated sanitized versions of events. The territorial and state governments of Arizona worked actively to suppress discussion of the massacre, viewing it as an embarrassment that might damage the territory's reputation and its prospects for economic development. School textbooks were carefully edited to remove references to the event, while public monuments and historical markers commemorated other aspects of frontier history. The massacre became Arizona's open secret, known to many but officially forgotten. Mexican families who had participated in or witnessed the massacre faced their own complicated relationship with its memory. Some Mexican women who had known the Apache victims personally carried guilt and sorrow for the rest of their lives, but they were constrained by family loyalties and community pressures from speaking openly about their feelings. Their grief became another casualty of the silence that surrounded the event. The Tohono O'odham community struggled with the legacy of their participation in the massacre, as younger generations questioned the wisdom of their ancestors' alliance with white settlers against fellow indigenous people. Some Tohono O'odham leaders attempted to provide context for their people's actions by explaining the long history of conflict between their tribe and Apache bands. But these explanations could not undo the reality that they had participated in the murder of women and children. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Camp Grant massacre had been effectively written out of popular history. Books about the Apache Wars focused on dramatic battles between armies of men, while the story of women who had died while seeking peace was deemed too complex and uncomfortable for mass consumption. Publishers and authors found it easier to sell stories of heroic cavalry charges and noble savage warriors than accounts of diplomatic women murdered in their sleep. The families of the Apache women who had died carried their stories forward in oral traditions that were carefully guarded from outsider interference. Children and grandchildren who had never known the victims learned their names and their contributions to the community through songs and stories that preserved their memory within Apache culture. But these traditions remained largely invisible to the wider American society that preferred its frontier history without such complications. Historians who attempted serious research into the massacre during the early 20th century found their work hampered by missing documents, unreliable witnesses, and active resistance from local authorities who continued to view the topic as politically sensitive. Academic accounts that did acknowledge the massacre typically relegated it to footnote status, treating it as a regrettable but minor incident in the larger story of Western expansion. The true tragedy of the Camp Grant massacre extended far beyond the loss of individual lives. Devastating as that was, the systematic erasure of these women's stories represented a broader pattern of historical violence that made similar atrocities possible in the future. By denying the humanity and agency of indigenous women, American society created a template for forgetting that would be applied to other inconvenient truths about the conquest of the West. More than 150 years after the massacre, the Apache women who died at Camp Grant remain largely forgotten figures in American history. Their names are not carved on monuments, their stories are not taught in schools, and their contributions to peacemaking efforts are not acknowledged in official accounts of frontier diplomacy. But their legacy endures in the oral traditions of their surviving people and in the growing recognition that the conventional narrative of Western expansion has left out too many voices, particularly those of women who sought alternatives to violence. The silence that surrounds their memory is not just an absence but an active force that continues to shape how Americans understand their past. Breaking that silence requires acknowledging not just what happened at Camp Grant, but why it has been forgotten and what that forgetting has cost us as a society. The Apache women who died seeking peace deserve better than the violence that claimed their lives. They also deserve better than the silence that has claimed their memory.